Welcome to Hiraeth, a home for the left in Wales.
Our episode today is looking at federalism. First, we are joined by the leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats, Jane Dodds. In the second half of the show, we'll have a discussion between Hefin David MS and Mark Cooper, talking about federalism and independence in Wales. Joining me and Kerry this evening to discuss federalism is Jane Dodds, the leader of the Welsh Liberal Democrats. Hello, Jane.
Hello there. Noswaith.
Noswaith hefyd. Thank you for coming onto the show this evening. As I said previously, we're going to talk about federalism. But before we go on to the subject specifically, a couple of days ago, you said that the Conservatives pose the biggest threat to the Union. Do you mind going in a little bit more detail about what you meant by that? And is that why you want a federal UK?
You know, it really is about their approach and attitude to devolution and how they're constantly undermining that. And we've never seen that as we have done in such sharp focus as we have in the COVID-19 crisis. An example, and it goes back pre-COVID, but as I said, it's been brought into sharp relief by COVID, is they're not talking to the devolved assemblies in both in Scotland and in the Senedd over Brexit. There was really no discussions, no opportunity for Wales to really put their viewpoints and their positions in relation to, you know, the kind of negotiations. The decline started long before that, but then if we go to COVID and we see what's happened here in Wales versus what's happening in England and the way that decisions are made, announcements are made, and we know from Mark Drakeford and from Nicola Sturgeon that we're not consulted on those. So, you know, it really is about us bringing a kind of profile to this, which is so important for us in Wales as we go into the Senedd elections next year as well. We've got to get this straight. The Conservatives are undermining us. And I can give lots of other examples. Daniel Kaczynski, MP for Shrewsbury, talking about how the Senedd should be abolished. How dare he? And where were the voices from the Conservatives saying, Daniel Kaczynski, stay out of it? You know, there weren't many. There was one or two. Fair play to them. But really, you know, it continues and we've got to stand up to it.
Jane, I want to pick up because tonight's episode is all around federalism. And I got to be fair, I wasn't familiar with the Lib Dem position on federalism. So I'd just be wondering if you could explore that from, you know, what does it mean for you?
It's about partnership of equals. That's the easy way of me saying it, really. It is about us obviously working together. It's about us really being clear about how we can be equal in the way we see our futures, which is about us recognising the separate identities that there are across the nations, but about us saying we need a fairer settlement, we need a fairer distribution of the resources, and we need a respect for our devolved settlements, which recognises how we can build a better future across the nations, but how we can do that in a way which is a real partnership, a real working together, a real sense that there are differences, but those differences are not outweighed by the sense that we want to move together as the United Kingdom.
I don't think federalism is that well known in the UK. You know, what kind of model do you prefer? Do you see it as the four constituent parts, or do you see a regionalisation of England in the federal structure? Have you got any thoughts on a model?
The issue around England is a really tricky one, isn't it? And probably, you know, I'm going to be exercising my Fifth Amendment opportunity here, which is I'm going to try not to talk about England, because once you get into England, then you get into, you know, Cornwall and Yorkshire and what have you. So I think it's really important that everybody makes the decision for their own nation according to their needs. We are very clear that the model is about, you know, a United Kingdom where we have devolved settlement, which actually is about growing that devolution agreement to home rule. That we need to be looking at devolving other powers to Wales, such as, you know, justice and the legal system, for me, it's about saying that it's not about nationalism. It's not about separating Wales from the rest of the United Kingdom. It's about a clarity around the relationship we want with the United Kingdom, whilst recognising the identity that we want here in Wales to make our own decisions and have the resources to do that.
Obviously, this has been a Liberal Democratic policy for a long time. How do you think the best way to implement this change would be?
I haven't thought enough about what it would involve in terms of the decision-making process, but I think I would rule out series of referenda across the UK, and certainly not a referendum here in Wales. I don't think it's well known enough about. I don't think we've put it out there enough. I don't think we've done enough to think about what it means for people's everyday lives. But we elect people to make decisions, and we elect our politicians and our Senedd members to make the decisions, and we should be confident in them making the decisions on our behalf. But yeah, I would see it as starting off with a series of citizens' assemblies on constitutional issues, on how we drive forward change, how we get ideas from people about how they want decisions made, and then to grow that from the grassroots upwards.
What do you say to those members of your party and to other parties who are being drawn towards independence? What about federalism should have swayed them from the view that Wales and Scotland and England should be independent?
Yeah, you're right about there being a move. You know, more people are indie-curious now. And I think the two big events that have moved people to be more indie-curious, you know, in the Welsh Liberal Democrats as well as in other parties, have been Brexit and COVID. Brexit, because people are very, very angry if they're internationalists and Europeans here in Wales, that we are in the position we are, which is that we've left the EU. And then COVID, almost for the opposite reason, which is that people can see the real positives that have come from Wales actually taking different decisions and, you know, kind of ploughing its own route through. That's been very different and has, I think, engendered a different culture in the way that we've approached the issue. But I think the indie-curious issue is something we need to be open and talking about. It is a fresh idea and a new idea in that it gives people energy. And I think the 16 and 17-year-olds coming into the voting arena as well, we need to recognise that many of those have joined Yes Cymru and are thinking about how they can look at independence as an opportunity to generate energy and excitement. So I would be starting that conversation with them around independence means that we separate ourselves from everybody. Independence actually for me is a Brexit for Wales. Independence could mean that we're another 3 years of kind of not focusing on the real issues. You know, as we did with Brexit, we got totally consumed by Brexit. And actually what we need to be looking at is what makes us the same, what makes us different, and how we can work on those without actually kind of creating this huge chasm between Wales and the other nations. And that we need to recognise that we have an incredible opportunity to work together now with people and exemplify the good things about Wales, the good things about having a devolved assembly, Senedd, the good things about having a First Minister who's been very clear about what we should be doing differently. This is exactly the right time. We should be talking about federalism and, you know, having the discussions around with people who are indie-curious as well.
Do you think federalism is a realistic approach for the UK now, or do you think we might have missed the window with where Scotland is? Or if Scotland does go indie, where would that then leave the rest of the UK? Or do you think federalism is still possible even with Scotland?
If Scotland does adopt independence and goes for it again and is successful, where does that leave us? You know, the Northern Ireland, England and Wales, where does that leave us? And I still come to the same answer, which is that it still means that we fight to remain as part of this bigger picture, and that we maintain our identity through that. And in many ways, we're in a stronger position. And let me just say why, because I am biased and I'm bound to be, you know, like yourselves, you know, we live in Wales and, you know, we'll be Welsh speakers, we'll have a Welsh heritage and our Welsh culture. And I think that is actually stronger for us here in Wales than perhaps it is for you know, Scotland doesn't have its own language. I don't think I pick up that it has, you know, the kind of cultural kind of bedrock that we do here in Wales with the Eisteddfods and you know, the kind of heritage and culture that we have. So I still think that we would have that strong voice of saying we want to stay with England and Northern Ireland. And of course, we'd continue a really strong relationship with Scotland, and that in many ways I think has probably grown between the First Ministers across Scotland and Wales in the COVID-19 period.
So picking up on that then, one of the things we had in a previous pod where we were looking more on independence, we had a Scottish academic on who was fantastic, and she placed it along the lines of Labour are ambivalent unionists. Would that be something, you know, you'd see in the kind of liberal approach to things?
No, it's not. I'd say we're strong unionists. You know, in every party, there's going to be people who, you know, are kinds of one extreme or the other. We're a broad church here in the Liberal Democrats, in you know, the kind of National Party. Broad church, we accept everybody's viewpoints, but we're strong unionists, and we believe in the union, and not only that, but I'm bound to get in that not only are we strong unionists, we're strong internationalists as well. And we were the only national party that fought to stay in the EU when it came to the elections and when it came to all of the campaigning. We were the only party that across the UK that said our position is absolutely crystal clear. We want to stay in the EU, and our position on unionism is equally clear. We want to stay in the union. We fought, you know, against the independence referendum in Scotland, and we fought for Scotland to stay with us, and we'll do that when it comes to the next Scottish independence referendum if it happens, and that's our position on Wales as well.
If independence presented a clear opportunity for Wales to rejoin the EU, how do you think the Liberal Democrats would decide on that issue? Do you think they would want to stay part of a federalised UK or a federalised Europe? What would you think would be the preference of Liberal Democratic members?
It's a really difficult one, and I think we would still say that what we want is for Wales to be to have a strong voice in Europe, to have a strong voice in the UK, to have those good arrangements and good partnerships both within the UK and within Europe. It really doesn't mean that we have to separate ourselves from one thing in order to jump into the other. We can do both. And that really is what federalism and internationalism is about. You know, what I want is for the UK to be offered the opportunity to rejoin the EU at some point in the future. And, you know, when the Liberal Democrats become the UK parliamentary party in power, then that will happen. We don't have to sacrifice one thing in order to get the other.
So what is the next step for yourselves? And also you've got Labour talking about federalism or confederation. I forget how many working groups they've got, but would you work with them, or have you got your own plans on that?
I mean, I think the next step is as we emerge from COVID, and you know, we've got to recognise that actually that has to be the priority here, doesn't it? The priority is really getting Wales back on its feet after the COVID crisis, and recognising the incredible sacrifices that many people have made, and also the tragic losses that have been suffered. So we must be absolutely proportionate in terms of our kind of approach here. But I think there is something that says we should actually be outraged that powers are taken away from us, and that there is a move to take powers away from us in Wales. We're already seeing that. Our right to self-determination should not be doubted and should not be challenged, and that's what it's been feeling like. And whilst we, of course, must ensure that we get on with the really important issues like our health services, our social care services, making sure our businesses are supported, making sure the environmental issues are addressed, and that post-COVID we've got a clear plan and strategy in place. That does rely in part on the support and the settlement and the respect that we get from Westminster. And we haven't had that. And that has been eroded throughout COVID and throughout the Brexit negotiations. And, you know, we've still got the Brexit negotiations that will continue now until, you know, December 2020. And we don't know we still are unclear what that's going to mean for us here in Wales. We should be outraged. We should really be furious that actually our right to self-determination and our powers are starting to be eroded. And I would like to start a discussion around that. Again, it goes back to what I said. It has to be everyday matters that apply here. So we have to think, how does that matter to the person, you know, whose door we're knocking on, or where we're delivering a leaflet, or the conversation that we're having. So yeah, I want to start that discussion when it's appropriate and when the time is right.
Would you consider it to be an issue along with the independence issue in next year's Senedd election, or do you think that that's far too soon for this kind of debate in Wales?
It will be an issue, definitely, and we're up for it. But we also think our health service and our education provision and our businesses and our environment are really at the centre of what we should be looking at. But of course it will be, because you know, we'll have, on the one hand, we'll have Plaid Cymru telling us that we need to go independent, and we'll have the Yes Cymru and the Indie Curious group saying the answer to all of our ills here in Wales is to become independent. And we'll have the are they called the Abolish the Assembly group now? I've forgotten what they're called, or Abolish the Senedd group. However, you've got them on the other hand. You know, it really is ridiculous. Abolish it, and let's all just give all the powers to the Parliament. So, of course, it will be a big debate, and of course, it will be a big issue. But I think it'll be in a political bubble, if I'm honest. But it's important that's where the big decisions start, in a political bubble. That's where internationalism, Europe, you know, the kind of support for Europe started. That's where a lot of the discussions start, in a bubble. And we need to take it outside. So I'm not saying it's wrong that we just have these discussions and debates that are on television, or you know, in podcasts like this or whatever. They're important, because that's where we start to really refine and fine tune what we want to talk about. And actually, what I'd like to see, and I think to a certain extent we started to see that in the COVID crisis, is the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales really working together to force better settlements for their respective countries, and really to up that and to just demonstrate the real strength that we have in devolved governments and devolved executives that really focus in on what this means for the health service, for you know, the environment, for education. That's where we need to focus it. We want more money for Wales. We want what we deserve. And we can only do that if we remain within the Union, and that we remain in fighting for a good arrangement with the UK Parliament, and to have the best deal for Wales out of the European negotiations as well. And that's the angle, you know, that we've always taken and will still continue to take when it comes to Senedd elections next year as well.
One of the things I'm interested in on federalism, Jane, and it's to take us out of the UK context, really, and look at federalism as a normal form of government in a lot of the world, a lot of Europe, a lot of our big European neighbours. But we generally, unless you're in that political bubble, really, you don't really see it. And our media certainly don't present the likes of Germany or Spain as federal countries. Why do you think that is? And I think we need to understand these places a lot more than what we do to get that buy-in. But also, is there anything you think we can learn on any of those kind of models around Europe, the wider world?
I'm surprised you haven't mentioned the C word, the coalition words. I think there's a lot we can learn from, federal states around the way that they govern. And one of the things, obviously, is that they're much more used to coalitions than we are. And they're much more used to partnership working and how you can really work with your worst enemy with a common purpose. So I don't know when there will ever come a time again where that may be a political solution in the UK. I can tell you that for the Liberal Democrats, it will be not in my lifetime, I don't think. And I'm not saying that's over my dead body, but I think probably I am saying that, given the pain and heartache, because we're just not used to it. We just haven't got our heads around what working with others is about. And that's in essence, isn't it? That's one of the tenets of federalism, that it's about partnership working. It's about sharing powers. It's about sharing resources whilst recognising the differences. But there has to be a common purpose. And I guess the issue for us in the coalition government that was here in the UK was that Liberal Democrats and Conservatives were miles apart. So it wasn't like there was much of a common ground, really. And we did it too quickly, and, we didn't look at other political models, confidence and supply, for example. I think there is an opportunity to look at those models, but I'm not sure the UK is going to be ready for that for a decade or even more. And as we go forward, we know it's going to be Conservative or Labour in terms of the United Kingdom ruling over us. And I don't think we're going to be ready for anything that's going to change that.
But do you think that these kind of changes, a more proportional voting system, federal UK, do you think those would be things that the Liberal Democrats at UK level would be willing to, if not go into coalition, perhaps provide confidence supply on with a Labour government in Westminster?
I think that's a really interesting question. And we'll look at what we've done in Wales with Kirsty being in the Senedd. And also, I think the Senedd and the Assembly previously has experience, doesn't it, of working with other parties. We worked with Labour 2003, was it? Something like that, and Plaid Cymru, so there's been a model here in Wales where we're up for that and where we're open for that. The focus always has to be not what's best for your party, but what's best for the country. And I know that's a bit kind of fluffy and what have you, but it is true. Without saying any more about the coalition governments, whether that will extend, if Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister, I don't know. I don't think we'll be ready for it, as in the Liberal Democrats at UK level will be ready for it. And don't forget that in 2010, Gordon Brown refused to go into coalition with the Liberal Democrats. That was apparently the first preference, but refused to do it. And I think there'd have to be a huge shift to see us moving in with the Labour Party in any way. But I think there should always be opportunities to work together and to look at clear ways that we can do that, on key issues.
Do we really see Westminster giving up any further powers at this stage, really, with the current administration?
I'm not sure, but I think we have to fight for it. I mean, I think it's the responsibility's on us, and nothing will change. Turkeys won't vote for Christmas. We have to really fight for that. We have to really demonstrate that. We're out. As I said, we're outraged. We're furious that we're in this place. And I, and like many others in Wales, I'm delighted that Mark Drakeford has had the publicity he's had. He's been on the national news over the UK. He has been featured as a different sort of leader, as a leader who's calm, who is about stepping back and being reflective. And I think, we have to demonstrate that further here in Wales, and we have to say, this is the deal we want. And we want our MPs and our representatives to fight for that when it comes to Westminster. We want people to sign up to that that's the way we have to go. How far we'll get, I'm not sure, but we have to make the effort to do it. You know, the whole idea about federalism is that partnership of equals. It is that we are all together in this. I don't know if you've ever watched West Wing. I'm watching it again, the entire series, for the 5th time. And there is a Jed Bartlett, who you probably know is the presidential kind of character. He talks about federalism and the federal states and the way the federalist system works in the USA in a debate. I think it's episode 122, where he's in a debate and he's asked by a senator from this very rich rich kind of state, and why should they give any money? Why should they give any money to the US government? And he goes through arguments really, really clearly. And he says, because you got this, Nebraska got this, and we're all sharing our resources fairly. And then he says to the senator, he says, so my reckoning is you've had $120 million worth of whatever it was. So when can we have that money back, please? It's really well put. And I was thinking about how can we translate that into that kind of journey. So do go and watch West Wing, not for the 5th time is my advice, because it does drive everybody else in the family wild when you can quote virtually every episode line for line, and you make people watch snippets from it and they're bored solid. But there are some really good examples where we can start that discussion around how we all have to be on board with this.
The one thing for me was just, and I can be persuaded on federalism quite easily with certain approaches, but if we're looking at the elected members to make these decisions now, and we look at Scotland, and Scotland is dominated by a party which has just got a focus on independence, do we really see them looking at federalism in any meaningful way with independence so tangible?
I think that's a fair point. And, in my brief period in Parliament, I had a different take on the SNP members of Parliament, the SNP politicians, because really what it felt like was that we were on the same page on so many issues, but their solution, just as Plaid Cymru's solution, it was one of splitting us off and making both them and us poorer. So I'm still unsure whether Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP will really want to fight for an independence referendum. And I think when they're not able to get it, of course, they'll turn the tables and blame Westminster for that. But I think there is a discussion to be had and to persuade them otherwise. And maybe the COVID crisis has started to talk about that. I mean, I don't know if you heard the radio this morning, but, Ian Blackford was being absolutely pilloried for taking a position that Scotland had dealt with the COVID-19 crisis with, kind of fewer deaths and, better response to care homes. And actually the statistics don't bear that out. I think there's a lot to be said for us again working together and coming back to this. We're better together. And it is this power, this partnership of equals.
Jane, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight and talking to us about federalism and a whole host of other things. Where is the best place to get hold of you, and what's the best way?
It's best through my Twitter handle, which is @DoddsJane.
Wonderful. Diolch yn fawr iawn am dod ar y sioe.
Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi hefyd. Diolch am dadl. Hwyl fawr.
Thanks again to Jane Dodds for coming onto the show. Now we move on to discussion between Hefin David and Mark Hooper, talking about federalism and independence. You join us here as we talk federalism with Hefin David, the member of the Senate for Caerphilly. Hello, Hefin.
Oh, it takes ages to unmute. Hello.
And also our first returning guest to the podcast, he who must not be named, Mr. Mark Hooper. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Max. You well?
I'm very well. Nice to have you back, Mark. And the first thing I really wanted to ask both of you is, why do you think we should or shouldn't have a federal UK? Hefin, if you'd like to start.
Okay. Well, all this came about from my interest, particularly in the principle of subsidiarity and the fact that decisions need to be made at the level that is most local to the nature of the decision. So, I take a very pragmatic view that if you're going to be making decisions about people's lives, then they need to be as close to those people as possible, depending on what the decision is. So, I've just been in a meeting about a planning application, and the first person I invited to that was a county councillor to help with the residents' concerns. And by the way, it was a Plaid Cymru county councillor, and we get on very well. So I'd like to say that at the outset for Mark. And, that is subsidiarity in action. And I think, you need to take a pragmatic view of it. If you look at the United Kingdom, we haven't got a United Kingdom based on the principle of subsidiarity. We got a United Kingdom, which power is highly centralised, and in a certain case in Scotland and Wales, also dispersed. But there's no rationale behind it. And I think we need a rationale. If you were designing a country or a state from first principles, you wouldn't design it like the United Kingdom is designed.
There's not a lot I disagree with what Heaven has just said. I think it's important that we have decisions made as close to the people who it affects as possible. And I think you can carry that all the way through. But the interesting thing is why we're here is because Heaven, as have lots of other people, are starting to recognise that actually United Kingdom as an entity doesn't work in its current form. Now, it's where you go to that and how you solve those problems, which is the critical thing. And this is where we need to, and again, I think there are lots of things that Heaven and I would undoubtedly agree on. We've got some massive issues ahead of us in Wales, and we need to have the ability to be able to solve them. So the issue of federalism, independence, but actually is all driven by the same thing. Is actually our country no longer works in a way that it used to, supposedly, to help people who are most in need. And I think that's where we should start this conversation from. We should start this conversation and talk about the things that we'd like to change, the policies we'd like to change, the levers we'd like to see changing, and then you fit a structure around it. Because as Heaven finished, and I'll finish on the same thing, if we were choosing the United Kingdom today, we wouldn't choose what we've got. So we know it's wrong. The issue is where does it go?
What do you think federalism would actually solve, or do you think it's just a very technocratic kind of response?
Well, Mark said, Heaven's starting to come around to this. I've always thought it. I'm not some sudden convert to redesigning the United Kingdom. I thought in 1999 when we were having the referendum on the establishment of a Welsh Assembly, I thought, well, this is only a sticking plaster on a bigger issue. What about the regions of England? How do you make sure that there is a balanced dispersal of power across the United Kingdom? And I don't think the Welsh Assembly or the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Parliament has even come close to addressing that. I think the Labour government in 1997 should have been braver. I think they should have put in a manifesto to create a balanced democracy and a codified constitution. And I don't think they needed a referendum to do it, because I think they would have had the backing of the Liberal Democrats, and that in itself would have taken them over 50% of the vote after the election. So I think it was actually a missed opportunity to do it back then. Although those of us who remember the referendum battle, it also brought out a whole load of people who wanted the status quo. You've got to ask the question, what's the salience of this? Would people really have not voted Labour or Liberal Democrat if they'd said, we're going to go ahead with the Code of the Constitution? I don't think it would have made the slightest bit of difference to the vote, because the vote at the time was about the economy, it was about the health service and education. That was what 1997 was about, and a huge dissatisfaction with the Tories. And in fact, most elections are about those things. And this issue of redesigning the United Kingdom, it should be a central plank of a progressive party of government's offering at an election, alongside the other things which people see as much higher salience in their lives. And that's where I think the Labour Party should be in 2026.
As Heaven described, had that happened in 97, you may not be in the same position as you are now with the way that Scotland has gone. So these are mistakes that have led to this position, but I now think we're in a position whereby Scotland is going to go. How it goes, I think, will be interesting. When will it be allowed the opportunity? And things could change. Things could always change. I think reunification of Ireland is becoming ever more likely. So these things are here in the reality of where we are. If we're talking about a federated England and Wales, then it's impossible to even consider how that might work. So I think we're talking about something that the argument, the ship has sailed, and it sailed a while ago, and it, perhaps, you know, Heaven has pinpointed the point where it could have been saved, but now the opportunity is to solve the things that really matter. Because I don't want to make this a Nick Clegg moment, but I agree with Heaven when the real issues are the other things that he talked about, and we need to be able to solve them. And we're seeing in the crisis that we're in and the crisis we're about to hit is that we're too reliant on people from away trying to solve our problems, and they can't. We need to talk about the reality, where we are and how it will change. But then we can solve the problems that really matter to people.
This being a debate, then let's look at where our differences lie. And my difference with Mark lies in the fact that I don't think that Scotland has a settled opinion on leaving the United Kingdom, in the same way that Britain didn't have a settled opinion on leaving the European Union. I think a referendum campaign may polarize and crystallize some people's views, but there's no certainty that that means that Scotland's going to leave. And in fact, putting aside the fact I fundamentally disagree with the principle of referendums, I think you've got to start with a single transferable vote electoral system. That's more important than holding referendums. You know, and I think that needs to be both in the Welsh Parliament and in the UK Parliament. But put that aside, our difference of opinion on Scotland, I don't think it is the settled will of the Scottish people to leave the United Kingdom. I think if you gave an offer, and the offer isn't going to come from the Tories, if this offer is going to come, it's going to come from a Labour government in Westminster. The offer, if it had to be a referendum, and I don't agree with it, but I suspect I may well be overruled. If you had to have a referendum, I think it would contain an option of independence, but I think the option would also contain a federalised structure within the United Kingdom. I think you could take England along with that as well. That's another place I disagree. A lot of people who argue against federalism say you can't have England, Scotland and Wales. Well, of course you can't. And my view is that England is not a unified country. If you look at what's happening with the coronavirus now, clusters of councils are being given power. Well, those clusters reflect regions, and those regions exist across England as they always have done. And I can't see how a good government couldn't persuade people that would be a good way of constructing a state. The other issue, I come back to this principle now. If I ever raise independence, my views on independence on Twitter, I get an incredible amount of abuse and attacks and quite nasty stuff, which never comes from Mark Hooper, I would also add. But there are a certain group of people who I think are a minority who want Welsh independence at all costs, always have done, and it's an ideological thing. I would support Welsh independence if I thought it pragmatically was the right thing for the future of our union, both Europe and Britain. But I don't think at this point in time it is. And those people who are ideologically in favour of Welsh independence will never accept anything that they see as a watering down of the purest approach to what they want the future to be. I think you've got to get there by compromise, by consensus, and agreeing a future that is best for the whole of the United Kingdom. And I also think, and Mark has poo-pooed this on Twitter, I've seen, that certain decisions are best taken at a supranational and international level, and that would be, you know, decisions on global relationships. And I think the United Kingdom is better placed to give Wales a powerful voice than Wales were they to go it alone. And I think that could be an area where we have respectable disagreement, because I can't see how we'll ever bridge that divide, actually. But I think that's important, and it is perfectly in line with that principle of subsidiarity. There are degrees at which we can end up at independence also. I know Carwyn Jones is in favour of a confederation. Now, I think you need to have a discussion before you get to that point. But really, I think I'd want my party to lead on that principle of federalism because of a very pragmatic view that subsidiarity is correct.
You know, I think we need to avoid pitching people as certain, this is the reason why people come to independence. My rationale behind thinking that independence is the right thing is all about pragmatism. It's all about being able to have the levers of power to answer our problems. Heaven's view, you've just got to look at where Scotland's going, and particularly, and even the coronavirus impact at the moment is crystallising that conversation and making it more and more likely that we're going to see Scotland demanding, because actually the principle has already been established that Scotland has the right to be able to take this decision themselves. They've been given one referendum. Admittedly, it was it was going to be a once in a generation referendum, but the principle has been decided. And I think you've got to be really careful to have multi-option referendums. You and I probably share some agreement on the overuse of referendums. I think they should have limited, if at all, use. Politicians are paid to take decisions like these and important decisions. I agree they should. But if we have a referendum, a multi-option referendum, I think will cause more confusion than it will actually solve the problem. Now, if it comes to how people come to this conclusion of independence rather than another form of structure within the United Kingdom, we've also got a challenge where the assumption that actually the United Kingdom is best placed on a global stage to represent all of our views better. And would we have an influence as a citizenship of Wales? And would that be best influenced through the United Kingdom? I think the United Kingdom for a long time, and this has been, different coloured leadership, so whether it's Labour or Conservative, we've proven to be the warmonger on times. We've proven to be the people who are not really active good citizens, global citizens. There are other better places, and being an active participant in the United Nations ourselves, I think would be a much better option. So I don't accept that view. But federalism can always be reversed. It still is a situation where we'd have power devolved essentially, and it's just power withheld. So what Hevin may do with his and Keir Starmer may do with their power could always be reversed back into a United Kingdom. So until we have some assuredness that wouldn't be the case, I feel we're talking about something that isn't real.
The fact that it could be reversed is actually quite attractive. I think, why would you want to make a decision that is going to lock you into something that may not work forever? So that argument that it couldn't be reversed, I think, is probably good. But that aside,
reversed by who, though, Hevin? That's the question. Reversed by the United Kingdom as a federal structure, or reverse? Would Wales, no country that's become independent of the United Kingdom, has actively sought to go back into being part of the overall whole. So this isn't going to, the chances of that happening, I think, are quite low. So it's the choice needs to rest with the Welsh people in terms of their decision.
I think once you undertake constitutional change that proves itself to be effective, there's no, I agree, there's no will to reverse it. And I suspect federalism will be the same thing. But once you leave the union, going back is almost impossible. And I do feel that an argument for leaving the UK Union, the UK Economic Union, is very similar to Britain leaving the European Union. I think a union in these times is a good thing. And I'm speaking as someone who's kind of I've always described myself as a Eurosceptic who voted Remain. I could definitely see the economic case for remaining in the European Union. I think Wales was better off in it, but democratically, it's hugely questionable. And part of me, you might not like to hear this, Mark, but part of me feels a little bit of relief at us leaving the European Union in democratic terms, because it gives us a say over our own democratic destiny, even if it abandons that rich principle of subsidiarity. So I can understand completely why people voted to leave the European Union. I can understand why people would want to leave the British Union as well. But I think a general trend towards leaving of unions is a bad thing. And there's a whole complexity around doing it that cannot simply be answered in a yes/no question in a referendum either. So the whole concept of having a referendum, you are inevitably going to be simplifying choices which are hugely complex down to a binary decision. And the problem with the referendum is that if you are on the losing side, so you are in the 48%, you are effectively told, shut up, you lost. That's happening time and time again, happened in the European referendum and happens across the globe where there are referenda. If you have a single transferable vote system of electing people to a parliament, if your party does not form the government, you still have members of parliament in that parliament. Now, that is part of the reason why I say if you're going to achieve change, the first step towards achieving change needs to be reforming the electoral system. It needs to be moving towards a single transferable vote system that gives proportionality. Only then can you start then talking about redesigning the state, because anything else doesn't give you authority to do so. And I include in that a referendum, which I think actually is a blunt tool that actually leads to more dissatisfaction and even civil unrest, I think, eventually. We've seen nothing good come out of the referendum on the European Union, and I can't think of a single referendum that has actually settled an argument. So if you're talking about having a referendum that leads to independence, which is irreversible, there's going to be a whole chunk of people, and quite a significant number, who will feel entirely disenfranchised and will be dissatisfied with the outcome of that. If you're going to achieve something, you need to do it through a parliamentary representative democracy. But the other thing a referendum does, it raises the salience of an issue. So any issue you have a referendum on suddenly becomes hugely salient in the eyes of people who previously wouldn't have escalated it above other issues. So, for example, a referendum on European Union was not a massive issue for people until Cameron decided to have a referendum on it to save his own party from UKIP. It wasn't a big issue for people, and it became this life or death issue only after the referendum result. If you had a referendum tomorrow on capital punishment and the vote was in favour of capital punishment, it would be exactly the same thing. Capital punishment would suddenly be a massive issue in our society. At the moment,
I think we could have a debate on referendum and we'd agree. We'd have a debate on single transferable votes and we'd agree. If it comes to the decision on independence, federalism, whatever the decision might be, I think at the moment we have no alternative way of solving that problem.
I disagree with that.
At the moment we don't, because we don't have a parliament that works that way. So we could.
Well, we need to vote Labour in the next general election, don't we? That's what we need.
Remember, Labour voted against proportional representation, so we should change that.
Mark, I'm going to come in now because we've got a little bit of a script which you two have torn through. And I think the issue on referenda and single transferable votes we can put in another pod. But
it's the heart of this, Kerry. It's the heart of this, because there's people trying to get their way on one issue by saying, the Plaid's vote in the Senate. They said, don't vote for, whatever you feel about independence, don't vote on that issue. Just give us a referendum. That's what they said in the Senate vote on independence. It's at the heart of this.
It is at the heart of it. It's all part of it, but what we're trying to focus on is the federalism side of things, because I can be persuaded by federalism. I think what Mark alluded to about Scotland, Northern Ireland going, where does that leave us? And that's completely different. But if we're looking at the federal position in the UK going forward, like, how do you see that working, Heaven? What structures are you looking at? Are you looking at a regional England, 4 constituent parts, and what powers do you see each of those areas having?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. I think at that point you need to bring in a constitutional convention and legal experts. And I understand that in opposition, Labour intends to run a constitutional convention. In the next, this crisis is not helping to achieve that. But the idea would be to start a constitutional convention while in opposition. But there are certainly options, and I don't think England is a single entity. So you split that up into different constitutional parts. You need to have a written constitution, and those dispersal of powers, they don't have to be uniform dispersal powers, but if you look at the way the regions would operate, there would certainly need to be something on a par with what the Assembly, and I use the word Assembly deliberately, what the Assembly will have had. Certain powers over, regional planning, over environmental issues, and even education. There's no reason why those can't be devolved to a regional assembly in England, with possibly the Welsh Parliament and Scottish Parliament continuing with greater powers because of the fact that we are nations. And I think that would entirely come through any pragmatic constitutional discussion that would need to take place to firm up what that proposal would be.
We're coming up against the things now that show the weaknesses of the devolved settlement. And a lot of people recognise those weaknesses when we came out. And the weaknesses were built into the system when it was first developed. They were built in for party political advantage, one could argue. But now we're in a situation where even if I'll argue for the northeast of England now for the hell of it. So they could end up with the same weaknesses being inbuilt into what they get because of this situation. And I don't think that's going to be something that's acceptable, because they'll soon find that actually what they want clearly is more powers. Because actually the one thing you find is that if one lever of power only goes so far, and you find you need the next one, and you need the next one, and you need the next one to be effective. And you take where we are now, and we're seeing that actually we're all dependent on the political decisions of Rishi Sunak, particularly when it comes to furlough during this pandemic. There is nothing that the Welsh Government can do that can adequately replace that system. If we were independent and we had our own central bank, we could get our own treasury to lend money on our behalf, and we could go and print money in the same way as they're printing money for quantitative easing elsewhere. So the options become a lot bigger. And I would be concerned if I was in the northeast of England that I'd be sitting there with this, half-baked solution to really big problems. And interestingly, the northeast of England, and I'm sure again this is something we probably agree with, the issues that the northeast of England face and the issues that Wales face on an economic basis are very, very similar. The one thing I think is worth considering is how those regions have changed in their allegiances in the recent election. So there's a big change out there that I don't think we'll recognise, and a part of that is because we've not given them the powers that they need.
So if you look at it on a federal basis, and it's the regions of England, what powers do these regions have, and how do they come about?
I suppose you don't want to get into the reserved and non-reserved powers debate. I think you could easily delay areas, and Mark says, it didn't work for the Welsh Assembly, and again, deliberately using the word assembly, but there's lessons learned there. I think there's an opportunity for those regions of England to be empowered along those lines I've already identified. Local education services, environment, large-scale planning, development, those areas that are suitable to a regional area of governance. And I think perhaps turn it around a bit, what is missing from the United Kingdom is regional governance. There's a huge layer of governance that isn't there, and this pandemic has shown that, in that they've had to create clusters of areas in order to deliver effective governance. The other thing about the furloughing and economic policy, I actually think in the early days, Rishi Sunak's policy worked. Furloughs across the United Kingdom and the furlough approach has been effective. It saved jobs in my constituency. I've deliberately not gone and criticised the Conservative government throughout this pandemic because, number one, people really don't want to hear it. But also there hasn't been a lot in economic terms at this point in time to complain about, because that policy has worked across the whole of the UK. What has been more effective has been the Welsh Parliament's, the Welsh Government's approach to local lockdown. And I think regions of England needed a regional approach there too. And I think they still do.
My point about the furlough was the ending of it. We have nothing to solve that when it comes to the end. So, and that just shows our powers are weak. We are reliant, we are dependent on others, and it's whether or not they understand the concerns we've got in our area. It's a very blunt instrument.
I was going to come in sort of on that point, Mark. Is there any sort of formulation of powers to you that you think that could make people who support independence more content with the union, more economic levers that you could have that would make people feel more comfortable within the union, or do you think it's gone past that point?
I think there's lots of things. We're all probably supportive of devolution better than being just part of the United Kingdom. So this has been an improved picture than it was before. And I think the way that we've dealt with, so I think the stamp duty elements, and I wouldn't agree with the core proposal, but the fact that some money has been saved to do something else that's more appropriate to Wales makes sense. So I think, there's a lot of things we can do and have done historically that you could argue would be better suited to Wales. But I think when it comes down to it, we have no ability to be able to effectively raise taxes in a different way, substantially. There's some tax varying powers, but we should be involving completely new taxes into our regime, new ways of benefit. There's calls in Heaven's Party for a universal basic income from some of the members. If that was a solution that really was to be taken on board, we would soon realise that we can't do it. So I think I'm generally supportive of us doing things, but they're just not enough.
I think the benefit of being in an economic union is, particularly when there's shit like the United Kingdom, there's huge regional imbalances across the UK. And there are wealthier areas in which money is washing around and areas in which money is scarce. And unfortunately, in Wales, we've got more of those latter areas than the former. And the part of a role of United Kingdom, speaking as someone in the Labour Party, is to redistribute wealth for the advantage of those who need it most. And I think, you know, part of a progressive tax system enables an economic union to share that more equitably. Now, of course, Conservative government is less interested in doing that. I don't think that's a part of a nationhood issue. It's the issue of democracy and ensuring that the parties that are elected to Westminster have the power to veto any non-progressive approaches. The Conservative Party have never had, the right has never had a majority in a Westminster election other than through the first past the post system. If you start with a single transferable vote system, I know we're coming back to this, but it's all connected, then you start to solve that economic problem too, because the parties that would be normally represented in an election would ensure that that economic union had fair and equal distribution of taxation. And, you know, if you leave the economic union, you lose that lever entirely. Even though that lever is not being used, the reason it's not being used is because you've got a flawed mandate in Westminster and a government that's refusing to do it. But you can change that by other means than simply leaving that union. Leaving a union, it just seems so final and uncertain. And there's an inherent danger to it. You know, you lose all the benefits of a union.
The biggest question that comes up most of the time when talking about federalism is how to make England work. If you look at the polling that comes from the Future of England surveys, time after time after time, the response that England wants is English votes for English laws, which they have now. They're not a massive favour of an English parliament. They're not a huge fan of regional parliaments. Even since the introduction of English votes for English laws, there now seems to be this out of nowhere call for English independence that's come from a couple of recent polls. Do you think that this idea of federalism is a popular one? And do you think that federalising England or giving England devolution would abate that independence desire in England?
I think one of the things that these polls tend to miss out on is salience. And I think you see a lot of people talking, there's this huge wave of people calling for independence, huge wave of people unhappy with the United Kingdom. There may be people responding to polls saying that they feel that way about when they asked about that specific issue, but it doesn't have a huge salience in their lives. And I think if you ask them instead about the economy or the health service or education, that would have much higher salience that would actually override all of those feelings. And it just comes back to the point where if you're going to make a central plank of your party offer a constitutional change, I don't think that party is going anywhere. I think you've got to make a clear economic and social offer first and say alongside that we will deliver the following constitutional change. And I think that is where you win the argument. If you go into an election saying, you know, we're all about Welsh independence, or we're all about abolishing the Senedd, or we're all about federalism, you're not getting anywhere. You're not going anywhere. You aren't offering anything that makes a fundamental difference to people's lives, and people are not going to look at your party and say, oh, that sounds great. Even if you say you go for independence and we'll be wealthier, even if you say that still doesn't connect with people. And also it's not true.
What makes society worthwhile, I think, is the key question. Because wealth doesn't just get managed in pound notes either, and I think that's one of the risks of this debate. I don't think any party, and I don't think Plaid in particular, and I'm not sitting here alongside you as a Plaid Cymru person in this. I'm talking about somebody who's interested in independence as an alternative. I'm just happen to be a member of Plaid. But the challenge that we've got is how do we solve some of the problems that devolution has failed to solve for the last 20 years, despite it having a left of centre government throughout all that time, with Labour being in power through all those 21 years. And I'm not somebody who spends my energy criticising the Labour Party for their lack of caring about these issues. The issue is about being able to solve them. Redistribution within the UK, even when we had a Labour government, did not solve the problems that have been in our communities and in the communities that you represent for so long. So we do need to solve them. And that isn't an answer that allows more and more of our economy to drip out to other people. The UK is a very extractive economy. Essentially, the wealthy do the best out of the UK economy. To change that, you need the UK in its entirety to want to change. And I don't think England is going to change in that regard. Had we had the opportunity to solve these problems, we would need all those levers that we talked about earlier. So this is actually about solving people's problems. It isn't just independence for independence sake. And I don't think Plaid are making that case anyway.
I just feel that this whole debate is about an agreement that the situation isn't as it should be. The previous assembly, right up until the last referendum on extra powers, hasn't had the tools available to it. And that's not been because we're not independent, but because the power distribution balance of the United Kingdom hasn't been right. I agree with that. And also, the reason that, as you say, there's been this hegemony of the wealthy is because the conservative right has been unified around one party, whereas the progressive left has been split into a number of different party political groups, and that simply disadvantages parties at first past the post-election time. So in order to achieve both constitutional balance and economic balance and the GVA kind of approach that you're talking about, it isn't about leaving the union, it's about reforming it and changing the way we give power out. Federalism is about how we distribute power to institutions across the UK, but also changing the way we elect governments is about how individuals give their power to governments. And I think both of those things need to happen together. And if you don't have a fairer proportional electoral system alongside a changed constitution, then you aren't addressing the issue. And I think for many, not yourself, Mark, but for many, leaving the union is a simple, easy answer, which proves not to be simple nor easy in the long run.
It's not going to be simple and it won't be easy, completely agree. But it isn't working now. And we're leaving things up to the chance and the choice of others to define our future. And the way our future is going at the moment, particularly where we are now and the way this pandemic's going to play itself out. And the one thing that I'm getting the sense of is that we're about to enter probably the worst economic position this country has been in since perhaps the 30s. And without the powers, we're going to be leaving some of these communities and some of these people and individuals in an awful state. So we can't wait. On the off chance that the Labour Party do something isn't good enough for Wales, because it didn't happen last time and it isn't good enough going forward. So we need to have this debate. If it means that the Labour Party moves towards a sense where actually we recognise that we need these powers, then I think that's a good thing.
Okay, and just to come back, when we say, the future's, if we stay in the United Kingdom, there'll be others doing things to us, and we won't be able to decide our future. You're making a big assumption about what others are and what we are. I'm still considering myself to be part of the United Kingdom, and the others you talk about are actually, I consider to be fellow citizens, and that's a significant issue that we can't just ignore and park, because if 48% of the country still see themselves as British, it's going to be a massive issue if there was a decision for independence. I'd also say in the coming storm, it's no time to be alone. I don't think that we should be reducing ourselves to ever smaller denominations in a turbulent tide, when we actually would be better in an economic union, although a very much changed one.
So the question I wanted to sort of wrap up with, talking about federalism, is how it happens in practice. Obviously, we've talked about the Constitutional Convention that the Labour Party want to do, but obviously for that to happen, for that to be put into practice, Labour would need to win a general election. We've had a number of podcasts recently where we've talked about the Labour Party in Scotland and how difficult it looks like it's going to be for Labour to win back support in Scotland. So this is a question to both of you, but to Hevin to begin with. How does Labour do this when it's so difficult to win back Scotland?
It isn't necessarily about gaining a majority, but it's about sure that there's an alternative government to the Conservatives that can form a majority. And I would suspect that if there was an opportunity to form a government and there was consensus, then I think federalism, if a constitutional convention in opposition produces a reasonably formatable policy, the Scottish National Party would be foolish not to at least consider that as part of an offer that they want to see in Scotland. And I can't see Wales opposing that. And if a Labour Party is elected with a majority in England, then that's entirely possible too. So I think the future isn't as uncertain. Isn't as certain as Scotland leaving, so therefore we've got to leave. I think actually there are huge options at the next election, and I think that debate will still go on. And I think the certainty by which the future of Scotland and Wales is being framed is quite unfortunate at the moment.
there's a reason that Labour lost Scotland. And the reason was that they spent their energy concerning themselves with things that the Scottish people were not concerned about. So this was about going back to, if we started this conversation talked about policies that people really cared about. And there came a point in time where Scottish Labour focused on things that didn't resonate with the people. Then you had a situation, at the end of the day, SNP were the same, in 2007, SNP were the same size as Plaid Cymru. So they've grown massively. And I would challenge Labour to understand why that happened. And we need to be in a position to be able to solve problems. If those problems are about to become more acute than we ever thought they would be, then actually we do need to consider things that were previously unconsiderable, and they come to power. I challenge Heaven. Heaven talks about us also being, it's important to be together in this environment. I don't think there's a point in my lifetime where the UK has been less part of the global community than it is now. We're aligning ourselves with people and communities who are not necessarily those who are all for cooperation. The way we just decided not to get involved in the PPE buying campaign, and I'm sure these are things that we would agree on, but this is the United Kingdom as an entity is almost becoming a pariah state in the way that it deals with other people. So we do have an issue about where we sit in the global world. Now, that stuff doesn't get resolved that easily. When it comes to Wales, so what lessons should Labour perhaps, and this is for them to solve, learn from Scotland? I think they should consider one thing is the speed of change, and the speed of change in Scotland was incredible. There is a speed of change happening in the calls for independence in Wales. When I was somebody who came to this cause rather than somebody who's been in it forever. But when people, we were looking at 6 to 8%. The last poll, when you take out don't knows, had 32% of people supporting independence. Now, whether those polls are right, and I'm one, who doesn't hang their hat on polls that often, but if that's in the ballpark, then we've got a faster movement for change in Wales than Scotland had at the same time. So if I was in the Labour Party, I'd be considering how do you make sure that we have radical solutions to people's issues, and they need to be front and centre. Those are the things that make the difference. And I would say the same thing to Plaid Cymru as well. Plaid Cymru also need to make sure that they have radical solutions to people's problems. When those radical solutions are stopped by being part of this mighty United Kingdom, then we need to start to question what's the point of being part of the United Kingdom.
We're obviously focusing on the UK, Wales in particular, but I'm just interested in your take on how federalism works in perhaps the rest of Europe, Heaven. I'd be interested in your take on where we could look for those kind of models, but also then your take on the likes of Catalonia, which are in that probably as most federal you can get as a nation state, and they've still got that growing large independence movement.
Yeah, and just before I answer that, Kerry, I'd say Mark has actually hit the nail on the head with his remarks. Then, I just think where we differ at that point is where we think the resolution of that issue is. I don't disagree with what Mark said in his final statements there. With regard to structure, I think Spain isn't a balanced state. It's not a balanced state, and I think the German land are interesting to explore. Even the United States is an interesting model. But the fact is, these are countries that have developed like Topsy over a long period of time. We are talking about a clean sheet and starting with something from scratch. So we can take examples of the best and the worst, but I think for the detail of that discussion, and I suppose, Kerry, I'm not going to be pinned down on delineating either the regions or the powers they should have of England and the powers that the Welsh Parliament, Scottish Parliament should have in the future, because I think that detail needs to be drawn out once we've agreed, and I think we have agreed from the leadership of the Labour Party has agreed that we need to move to looking at a codified constitution and federal structure. To draw out that detail at this point probably is premature.
Catalonia is quite a different case to Wales as well, I think, in terms of its, it's where a lot of wealth in Spain is stored. So I think there are different arguments for Catalonia. I think it just shows that Spain hasn't got over some of the issues that it's had that stretched into, you know, pre the Second World War. There are some big issues of differences in the way that they split up the regions. Let's focus on what we need to do to solve problems. When we can't solve them within the United Kingdom, how do we best address them? When we come to the point where actually we realise that that can't be addressed via any of these things that Heaven is talking about, then I think we're left with very little option but to be able to do it ourselves. And the crux of it is, what are the things that we should be doing that make Wales safer for people, into economically safer, health safety, all these things that make Wales safer? How do we do it? And if we can't do it as part of the UK, we need to do it ourselves. I'm convinced we can't do it as part of the UK. And I'm convinced that with the best endeavours of whoever is taking on the role of government in the Welsh Assembly, within the Welsh Parliament, with the powers that they have, they won't be able to deliver the changes that we need.
Carwyn Jones's view on a confederal UK. Do you think that's something that would be able to bridge the gap in the divide in the discussion at the minute?
I spoke to him last week during the Plaid debate, and he's convinced that the Confederation is the way forward. It's a different model. It's more towards independence than a purely federal model. Federal has a great deal of centralism in it, which would worry some people. So I think that conversation needs to be had. As I say, I'm very pragmatic. I feel that just leaving the economic union is not a pragmatic act, but looking at different models of structure of a union is a good thing to do, and that's pretty much where I am. And I think the way Mark and I depart in our views are, not what the problems are. And I think he's absolutely right. Any political party needs to listen to what people care about most and what they fear most, and the minute you stop doing that, then the minute you lose power, you need power to have power to make people's lives better.
So if an independent Wales, we're on an island, we're sharing an island with England, or the federated England that may remain after Heaven goes, as all his esteemed colleagues tend to go, is to the Mother of Parliaments rather than to our Senate. But if there's if we were an independent nation, we would choose, I think, to want to have a good relationship with the regions of England, the country of Scotland, and the United Ireland. So I think there would be things that we would want as part of that agreement that would share, because a border, I have no compunction to want to stick a wall up along Arthur's Dyke. There are some issues about how we work together which are really important. We have towns and villages that actually straddle the border. We have people who currently, their kids go to school in Wales, they live in England, and vice versa. They go to the doctors in the other country. So I think there are things that we would want to make sure were agreed between us, and that may form some sort of a confederal approach. But it would be after we would decide that as a country, and this would be on the basis of us going into this as a voluntary union. This isn't Mark Drakeford suggested that we're in a voluntary union, but we never entered into it voluntarily, neither did Scotland. They were forced into it. The new arrangements would be voluntary and on the basis of a democratic decision by our parliament.
I just worry if leaving the UK union is done by saying we don't like the fact that Conservatives are in government and we leave it. I don't think a Conservative government would then be well disposed to fostering this lovely friendly relationship with Wales, and that does concern me a bit. But I think the best way to do it is through a government that wants to see a change in UK government that wants to see a change across the United Kingdom, and I think that's a more effective way of doing it. But I just feel there are different ways of approaching this problem than the starting point of independence for Wales.
We need to recognise there's a problem and then want to solve it. Where that leads us will be the interesting place. And I think we need to do some work and understanding as to what things would come with the different structures. So the case needs to be made. I accept, having you've been on this bus the federal bus for a long time. If that's the case, then these arguments need to be made, and they need to be made in a way which persuades people. And I think the same thing needs to be for independence as well, because actually, if we just follow what the UK is and have a little UK in Wales, I think that would be as damaging to Wales as it was before. We need to want to change things. And independent Wales, in my book, needs to be quite a different place than it is at the moment. So it needs to be fairer. It needs to solve some of these big issues that are ahead of us that we're just not solving as a United Kingdom. But we're at a point where at least we're challenging the thing that is wrong is the way the state operates at the moment. And I think that's a welcome conversation, and it should be extended. And it should be done in a way that's collegiate. We should want to have this conversation in a way that challenges each other. Where it ends up needs to be the most appropriate place for the people of Wales. And those people of Wales can be people who come into Wales as well. I don't think this isn't an ethno-nationalistic debate on my part. This is about a civic nationalism, which is quite different than it's sometimes being portrayed as.
And on that moment of agreement, positive agreement, I think, between Mark and Hevin, maybe, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank both our guests this evening. So thank you, Hevin. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they wanted to? What's your Twitter handle?
Now
it's been mentioned so much.
I tend not to use my Twitter very seriously, to be honest with you, because I think it's such an echo chamber and not a particularly helpful one. If people want a serious conversation, then hevin.david@assembly.wales. hevin.david@senedd.wales.
Mark, thank you very much for being here again, our first time, second time guest. What's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
I don't do Twitter.
That's the second time you've made that joke as well. It's we're going to see how many times you do it when you're on the show.
Mark J. Hooper.
Wonderful.
And I'm going to start looking at Hevin's tweets more closely now, given that he set me the challenge.
Mark, my staff run my Twitter feed. I don't have nothing to do with it.
If you like what you heard today, please take the time to find us on Medium at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, on Facebook at Hiraeth Blog Cymru, and on Twitter at Hiraeth Blog. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.